Well, good afternoon, everybody. Here we are at the Duncan Showroom, yes, for another live broadcast. And this week, on a Sunday afternoon, it's going to be storytellers. Once again, this is a pretty damn good thing. We've been doing once a month. And I know there's a few people still on their way. Traffic is a really big one this weekend. Maybe it's all those Americans on their weekend, because this is their... Why did they have two different weekends? That we got last weekend and they got this weekend? Memorial Day or something. Be nice to see some American money up here, though. It really is pleasant. I got a bank account of money that was, that comes to the showroom, or it comes to the festival, and I buy it off the festival and plunk it in the bank account. So I got like over $1,000 American. That's almost $1,500 Canadian. Wow. Emergency plan. That's what that is. Investing in the no, I won't want to do that. That's another story. We don't want to get into those stories. These are pleasant stories. Sometimes a little jagged, sometimes a little takes you down a path before it gives you redemption. I kind of like that. And what we have is the people, there are guilds, there are storytelling guilds on Vancouver Island, which is really cool because they understand that it's not just telling a story, there's a whole process to doing it and the learning process and how it's actually delivered. And there's one in Nanaimo, there's one in Victoria, and there's one in Parksville, Qualicum. And there's been talk about one. I know that some people down in Shawnigan Lake are trying to put something together as well. Start to get that little seed planted so we can have more of these all over the island. It's a wonderful, wonderful time. See some regulars here today. I like that. They always come each week just to find out what they're going to learn, because there's all sorts of little undertows to every little story that's told. Lee here is the one who's in charge of it. She's the one that came to me, and we decided to start this just before COVID. Took a break during COVID, and then we decided to get back at her again. We're going once a month, and we're not stopping for the 39 days of July, are we?
Not till then, no.
No, we're going to do a show in the 39 days of July on the fourth Sunday of the... Is it the fourth? Yeah, the fourth. Fourth Sunday of the month at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the park, the Vital Stage in the park. Come down and check that one out if you're a storyteller or lover. But right now, we're going to give it back to Lee, and she's going to take it over and start telling you everything that has to be done. Take care and welcome. Give her a warm welcome. That's what we need.
Part of the fun of coming here is to listen to Longevity John's introductions. I never know what he's going to say, which is comforting to me because that gives me license to say whatever I think might be fun, too. So today we're here for Crimes of the Heart. I'm Lee Porteous, and on behalf of the storytellers on Vancouver Island, want to express our gratitude to Longevity John for the opportunity to tell stories here in this wonderful theater that he has created, and to Ted Cadillac for making us heard and seen so well. Whenever you come to see us, we encourage you to make a donation to help keep the showroom open and the stories happening here. This is one of a series of storytelling events each month through to including June of this year. Your tellers will be storytellers from the three adult storytelling groups that you've just heard Longevity tell us about. And we acknowledge with respect the Cowichan First Nation, the largest single First Nation in BC, on whose traditional territory this event is taking place, and whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Welcome to all of you who are here, or will be joining us online, and those who are here today. For those of you here with us, please mute your phones, and you'll have a chance to check them during our mid-show break, and also chat with the tellers, Ted and Longevity John, and each other. Our first storyteller is Laurie Giffen, and she is presently living in Cobble Hill. And she came out here to help with her parents, and she's been here for 7 years, I think, now, and has been storytelling, particularly with the Victoria storytellers, and helping us with a lot of the technical stuff, you might say. So web pages and electronic invitations. It's help. Laurie knows what to do. It'll say in my subject line, "Help, Laurie." And she swans in to help. She's developed a great interest in the history of her family, particularly in Nova Scotia and beyond, and genealogy as well. So she's also well aware that there are stories out there that have been told for 1,000 years or more. And you know, we keep reliving them in one way or another. So she's here to tell us Rapunzel.
Thank you, Lee. So the fun of you guys improvising your introductions is that I don't know how to introduce my story now, so I'm just going to launch into it. John was a Winslow. Sorry, he was not. He was a Kempton. John Winslow Kempton. He was a Kempton. It wasn't his fault, right? A kid doesn't decide the family that they're born into. And the Kemptons were quite a normal family when they left Massachusetts and moved to Nova Scotia in 1760. John wasn't even born when his father had an accident in a sawmill and lost his right hand. He was pretty good at adapting and was able to use that stump and his left hand for most jobs, but he just wasn't able to earn as much money as he had before. He lost his hand. John, as one of the middle kids, grew up in a house where his father worked 7 days a week. His mother took in laundry as well as looking after the large family. And John grew up, like the other kids, helping out with the garden, fishing, trapping, snaring hares and hunting for deer and trying to get food on the table. But every year, late winter, early spring, there came a time when there just wasn't any food in the Kempton house, and they had to turn to the community for assistance. It wasn't a huge problem. That was the normal course of things. People helped families who were struggling like that until the American Revolution broke out. And the Revolution, what happened was that the English wouldn't arm the local fishermen. Americans did. And so you had fleets of privateers coming up from the States. And the English wouldn't arm the locals because they'd come from Massachusetts, and the English were worried that they would join the revolution with English weapons. So they wouldn't give them any weapons. So you have unarmed fishermen and merchants who couldn't leave the harbor. Their trade was pretty much stopped. You couldn't fish in the ocean. And so hard times came to all of the people in the settlement. And when spring came and the Kemptons had their normal crisis, people felt like they didn't have extra food on their table to share, and resentment started to build. Young John lived with that resentment. He grew up with it, didn't know anything different. When Joseph Bangs took him on as an apprentice boat builder, he knew it was a charity case. And nobody really expected him to succeed in that role. They were surprised when he did. He was a hard worker and he was smart. And over the years of his apprenticeship, people started to revise their opinion of John. But he was still a Kempton. And that meant that he wasn't considered marriageable. There was no young lady in the town of Liverpool who would look to him as a potential husband, except for one. And for John, that one was enough. Sarah was a Snow, and that meant royalty. The Snow family were wealthy ship owners and merchants, and Sarah's father was the most famous of them all. He owned and sailed the largest and fastest schooner. He took it farther than other ship's captains sailed their ships and had grand adventures. He was famous, he was popular, and he was daring, strong. So much so that at the end of the Revolution, when the English finally allowed the people of Liverpool to put one privateer together and gave them enough guns for one boat, Captain Snow was the one who was chosen and elected to be the captain of that ship. And that became the start of the privateer time in Nova Scotia that many people who know the history of the place will be familiar with. But there also comes a time in the life of this kind of man, and you can probably see this coming, when his ship just didn't come home, right? And eventually he was late, it didn't come. And then there were some stories from eyewitnesses in other ships that trickled in. And eventually he was declared dead and his estate was tidied up. And that left Sarah an orphan. Her mother had died when she was born. So she was an orphan, she and her brother. Her brother didn't mind. He was already old enough to be working on the ships as a sailor, and he showed all of the abilities and the potential that his father had done. But for Sarah, it was different. The option of going to work wasn't there. When her father went to sea, for her whole life, she had been left with a friend of the family. And this woman had married the sheriff of the town. And so Sarah was a guest in their home, a guest who was perfectly willing to help with chores and things like this, and she was sort of part of the family. But when her father died and they adopted her, then things changed, and it wasn't for the better. She found that the sheriff turned into a bit of a bully. Work was assigned and piled on, and negative feedback was given. No thanks. None of the generosity that she'd experienced before. She put up with this. She didn't feel like she didn't have much choice. Until the day that the sheriff came home and announced her engagement. And he told her that she was going to be marrying a man of his own age, one of her father's friends, who was ugly, rich, but old, and not somebody that Sarah was interested in. Now, Sarah's father had always treated her well. He had always told everybody and promised Sarah herself that she would be able to choose her own husband. He didn't believe in arranged marriages. So Sarah was shocked when the sheriff broke this covenant with her father. That's when she put her foot down. The argument was loud. People were talking about it all over town before it was even finished. And the day ended with Sarah upstairs, locked in her room on the top story of the house. And the sheriff said she wasn't going to be allowed out until she came to her senses. So John heard about this. Sarah was his friend. He was a little soft on Sarah, but she had always been friendly to him. A lot of people were worried about her. Everybody knew about the covenant with her father and the promise that she would be able to choose her own husband. There was no surprise that she argued, but, what's wrong with, how is she? He waited, though, until the town went to sleep. The sun went down. People closed their doors and windows. The lights went off. And in the wee hours of the night, he walked quietly to the street where she lived, and he tossed a couple of pebbles up onto her windowsill. It was the old signal, and she answered. She opened the sash, and she leaned out of the window, and her long golden hair flowed out down the wall, just like a rope. So John's down below. He said, "Sarah, are you okay?" And Sarah says, "Yes, John, I'm okay. Don't worry about me." And he said, "I'm hearing things about the argument. Are you really locked in your room?" She said, "Yes, John, but don't fuss. Don't worry about me. I'll be okay. I'll find my way through it." And he said, "Sarah, I can come back with a ladder. We can go away. We can go to Halifax or Boston or Montreal and start over." And now, all the accounts that I read, the gossip, the diary entries, the newspaper account, even the court record said that Sarah Snow turned John Kempton down, right? And here's what she said. She said, "John," she said, "you're getting such a good reputation. You have a bright future in this town. I don't want you to do anything that damages it. I have made a vow that I'm not going to marry anybody. No one at all. So I'm not the one for you. One day, you'll see, there will be a girl who sees you just for who you are, and she'll be happy to marry you." So, of course, John was devastated, and he turned away and went back home to his bed. He went to work the next day, tried to work. Everybody was talking about it, right? All the gossips at their windows who had heard sound travels at night. And in towns like this, everybody was interested in what was going on. But he got through the day, and at the end of the day, some of his friends invited him to come with them up to the tavern to drown his sorrows. And he was happy to join them. So he did. Went to the tavern, had a few beer, had a few more. You know how it creeps up on you sometimes when you're distracted? So he'd had maybe too much to drink by the time the sheriff arrived with his friend, the one he wanted Sarah to marry. And they paid no attention to the young group of men at the table or the patrons at the bar. The two of them made a beeline to the sheriff's favorite table in the back of the tavern, and they sat down and ordered their drinks and had a conversation. And this irritated John. And in his inebriated state, he thought it was a good idea, after he finished his beer, to push out his chair and not leave the tavern. No, he too made a slightly weaving beeline across the floor to the back of the tavern and to the table where the sheriff was sitting with his friend. And John said, "Sheriff, I lost a lot of respect for you. We all did." He said, "You know that there was a covenant with Sarah's father that she should be treated with respect and that she has the right to choose her own husband. You're just a bully, and we'll all lose respect for the bully." And the sheriff, interrupted in his conversation, heard some of this, and his answer was to put his hand on the chest of the young man who stood too closely and insulted him and push him away and say, "Mind your own business." And John Kempton answered the sheriff with his fist. The fight was what everybody was writing in their diaries about and everything else. It was legendary. At the end, there were a few broken chairs, some damage to the wall of the tavern. And I wanted to tell you that the sheriff had lots of experience with bar fights, right? He was a big man. That's why he was sheriff, right? He was good at fighting. But John, he had worked hard his whole life, and he was quick, and he had just come into his full strength as a man, right? So it was a good match. It was a legendary fight. There was damage to the tavern, and in the end, John had the sheriff pinned down on the floor. And the fire axe that's usually over the door of the tavern was in his hand, and the blade of it was along the sheriff's neck, like that. And that was the end of the fight. And John said, "Sheriff, I'll let you up if you promise before all these witnesses that you will let Sarah Snow marry the man that she wants and stop bullying her." And the sheriff did. He said it loudly. He said it clearly so that nobody in the tavern could mistake what he had said. And when John was satisfied that that was done, he let the sheriff up. He was promptly arrested for assaulting an officer of the law and thrown in jail, where he was left to sober up and think about the consequences of what he'd just done. Overnight, in the morning, he went before the judge. Now, the judge had been one of the patrons at the counter of the tavern, so he knew what had gone on, and he also had some witness accounts. And he was kind of sympathetic to John, but there was no arguing with the fact that John had thrown the first punch and he had assaulted an officer of the law, so he was convicted. And the judge, in an attempt to be lenient, gave him a fine. And it was a reasonable fine, something that a young boat builder should be able to afford. It was only enough to pay for the repair of the chairs and the wall at the tavern and the damage that was done. But John was a Kempton. Every penny he had ever earned had gone to the care and keep of his enormous family and all his siblings. he didn't have anything saved up and couldn't afford to pay the fine. So in those days, you stayed in jail when you couldn't pay the fine. It was frustrating to John. How do you earn the money to pay it if you can't get out of jail to work, go to your job? But he had no choice. There he was, stuck in jail, because he was a Kempton. In the morning, though, the jailer opened the door and let John out. Your bail has been paid. And as he exited the jail, he found waiting outside for him Sarah Snow, wearing her Sunday best, carrying a little purse. And on her way to the jail, she had stopped to visit the judge, who had also been a friend of her father, and the executor for her father's will. And he had in trust some money that her father had left for her dowry. And she had withdrawn some of that money and used it to pay John Kempton's bail. The marriage was 3 months later. Everybody came, including the sheriff and his wife. And as for John Winslow Kempton and Sarah Snow, they lived happily ever after. And that's my Rapunzel story.
And thank you, Lori. That was a good story. Nice if you have blonde hair, eh? Long blonde hair. Parlay into a good story. Our next teller is Andrea Brimmel, and she began storytelling for children at the Greater Victoria Public Library when she was a children's librarian there. Her introduction to storytelling was through a workshop put on by members of the Victoria Storytellers Guild, Pat Carfra and Nahama Firstman. When her job changed and she became a manager, she joined the Victoria Storytellers Guild and transitioned to telling stories to adults. And that is how we end up having her here today. She is now serving as president of the guild that she joined after switching to become an adult librarian.
Good afternoon, everyone. We had rather a harrowing drive up from Victoria. Not that there was any accidents or anything, but just a lot of traffic. But I'm very happy to be here today. I struggled with the theme, crimes of the heart, because I could only think of, well, crimes of the heart. You asked for it. Long ago, there was a miller, and he had a beautiful daughter named Mary. He had high hopes for her that she would marry beyond her station, and he decided to keep his eye out for suitable suitors. You know, he turned away many people, many men who worked in the village. He just thought there would be something better. He wanted his daughter to have money and to be comfortable and not to be struggling and working so hard as he had. Well, one day, a man came to his house and asked for Mary's hand in marriage. And this man appeared to be wealthy. The way he was dressed, the way he came with a horse and carriage. And he couldn't see any reason why not. And so Mary became betrothed to this, her future bridegroom. Now, Mary didn't feel comfortable with this man. She felt a certain recoil from him, and almost horror, but she couldn't pinpoint it. She couldn't really think of a reason to tell her father. And so the courtship went on, and he came and visited her many times. But one day he said to her, "Mary, my love, you have never visited me at my house." And Mary had been dreading this day. So she said, "Well, I don't know where you live." which seemed like kind of a feeble excuse, and of course he had an answer for that. "Ah, but I will show you where I live. I have a large house, a big mansion in the forest, and I would like you to come on Sunday. I have invited guests, so all you have to do is come by yourself. I will make the way clear for you. I will sprinkle ashes from here to my house so you won't have any trouble finding my house." And Sunday came, and Mary set out, and there was the trail of ashes. But she didn't want to leave anything to chance, and so she had filled her pockets with dried peas and lentils. And she set out into the forest. It was a beautiful day. The sun was shining. The birds were cheeping. But as she went deeper and deeper into the forest, she couldn't help but feel slightly ominous. However, she came to the house. There it was in a clearing, a beautiful mansion. There didn't seem to be anyone around. She approached. She knocked on the door. There was no answer. But her curiosity was now piqued, and she thought, well, if no one's home, maybe I can go in and explore the house and just see what my future home is like. So she tried the door, and it opened. She went in, and there wasn't anyone around, but a voice came out of nowhere saying, "Go home, young bride, go home. This is a house of murderers." Mary thought, what is going on? And then she heard it again. "Go home, young bride, go home. To this house, murderers will come." And then she saw a bird cage in the corner. It was only the bird. It was only the bird. And so she decided to explore the house. She walked all the way up the stairs, checked all the rooms. They were beautifully furnished. Everything looked normal, but still no one. So then she decided to descend to the cellar. And so down she went. It was dark, and she started to hear some noises down there. And she was quite pleased to see an old woman down there. But it was kind of mysterious. She was tending a fire over which was a large cauldron filled with steaming water. And when the young woman saw her, she shook her head and said, "Who are you? Who are you? What are you doing here?" "Well," said Mary, "I'm here to meet my bridegroom. Is he here?" The old woman shook her head and said, "No, no, you mustn't come, you mustn't come, you must go, you must go. This is a house of murderers." But then she quickly changed her mind and said, "No, it's too late, it's too late. I'll hide you, but don't move, don't move." And she hid her behind some wine casks in the corner. And she said, "Soon your bridegroom will be arriving with a band of robbers. And well, you will see what you will see." And soon after that, there was a lot of noise outside of people arriving, horses, carriages. She could hear a lot of voices, and she sounded like she could hear a woman as well. And soon the door was opened, and these men all came in, and they started coming down the stairs. They were all drunk and shouting, and they were dragging with them a young woman, dragging her down the stairs. Mary crouched behind the casks, and her heart went thump, thump, thump. She dared not move, dared not breathe. There was too much noise. No one noticed her. And the young woman, they dragged her literally by her hair and sat her at a table. And there they poured her 3 glasses of wine, one red, one white, and one yellow, and they pushed them toward her and forced her to drink them, one after the other. And by the time she finished the glass of the yellow wine, it was too much for her, and her heart gave out, and she fell on the floor dead. But that wasn't the worst of it. From there, they proceeded to strip off her fine clothes, and they laid her out on the table, and they chopped her up, ready to put her into the pot. They sprinkled salt on her. Mary was aghast. One of these men was her bridegroom. Then one of the men noticed a gold ring on the young woman's finger, on her hand. He tried to get it off, but it was stuck. And so he took a hatchet and he lopped off that finger. And the finger just went chop, whoosh, and flew off into the corner and landed right in Mary's lap. And so, of course, the man proceeded to try and find it. And he brought a candle over there and started poking around. The old woman said, "Oh, no, don't worry about that now. Let's eat first. I mean, that finger will be fine there until the morning. Look for it in the morning." And all the men were like, "Oh, yeah, for sure. Let's eat now." So they proceeded with their horrible task, which I won't describe. And the old woman, she took a sleeping potion and put it into their wine because she had never had the chance of escaping from this place. She was too afraid to do it by herself, but she thought and hoped that she and young Mary could escape later. And sure enough, all the robbers soon were snoring, slumped all over the floor, asleep from the potion in the wine. So the old woman said to Mary, come out now." Mary could hardly move. She was shaking. She was paralyzed with fear. But the woman said, "I will help you to escape. Let us go now." And so she had to tiptoe between all the robbers. She was terrified, but eventually they made their way out into the moonlight. And of course, all the ashes had blown away. So Mary began to look for the peas and lentils that she had sprinkled along the way. And believe it or not, they had started to sprout. So they were firmly in place. And she and the old woman were able to make their way back to Mary's house. And by this time, it was almost the morning. The old woman decided to go on further. She wanted to get as far away from those robbers as she could and their terrible, murderous den. Now, I'm sure you can all imagine the horror that Mary had experienced. But we're just going to move ahead now to the wedding. All the plans were made. The guests were invited. The feast was planned. And the day of the wedding came when Mary was to be married to the robber bridegroom. All the guests had assembled. The bridegroom was there. The feast was underway. Everyone was sitting around telling stories. And at last, the robber bridegroom turned to his young bride and said, "Mary, my love, do you have a story to tell?" Mary said, "Very well, I will tell a story. This is a dream I had," she said. One day, I was walking in the forest, in the deep, dark forest. And then I came upon a mansion in the woods. I went up the stairs. I knocked on the door. There was no answer. I opened the door and I went in. There was no one there. But then I heard a voice saying, "Go home, young bride, go home. To a house of murderers you have come." The bridegroom said, "But my love, it was but a dream." "Yes," said Mary. I then heard the voice again. "Go home, young bride, go home. To a house of murderers you have come." But it was just a bird in a cage. "Yes," said the bridegroom, "it was but a dream." "Well then," she said, "I explored the house. I could find no one. But then I went downstairs to the cellar, and I met an old woman by a cauldron of boiling water. And she said, 'What are you here for?' And I said, 'I'm here to meet my bridegroom.' And the bridegroom said, 'But my love, it was but a dream.' 'Yes,' she said, 'it was a dream. It was a dream.' And then the old woman said, 'You must hide now. You must hide, because they're coming soon. Quickly, quickly.' And she hid me in the corner behind the wine casks. And soon there was a lot of noise, and all these people came, all these men came, and they were dragging a young woman by her hair, and they seated her at the table, and they made her drink 3 glasses of wine, red, white, yellow. It was too much for her. Her heart burst, and she died. My love, it was but a dream." "Yes," she said, "it was a dream." "And then," she said, "and then they chopped her up and put salt on her, and they were about to cook her. But then they saw the gold ring on her finger, and they chopped off the finger, and poof, that finger flew through the air, and it landed in the corner. And with that, she lifted up her hands, and there was the finger with the ring upon it. By this time, the bridegroom had leapt to his feet. His face was pale. It went white, whiter, and then he began to run. But everyone was ready, and they restrained him and bound him and turned him over to the authorities. And in due course, he was executed, and all his band of robbers as well. And if that isn't crimes of the heart, I don't know what is. Thank you.
Well, we're learning one thing, and that is don't let anybody else pick your bridegroom. And also, listen to little old ladies. They know what they're about. Anyway, so our next teller is Richard Brimmel, and he's going to tell The King Who Wanted to Touch the Moon from Magical Tales from Many Lands, retold by Margaret Mayo. Richard became interested in stories from his wife Andrea's involvement with the storytelling, and got into telling stories after taking a course with Jennifer Ferris early in 2023. His help has been very valuable to the Victoria Storytellers Guild in enabling us to broadcast our stories at Fern Street. That's the third Monday of most months at 7 o'clock, and you can tune into that, except for this month. It's the 10th, so the second Monday. Anyway, if you're able to see it, it's because Richard helped you do it. Come on up, Richard.
It's well known that kings and queens like to have their own way. The king in this particular story was more than usually autocratic. His orders had to be obeyed promptly, no backtalk, no discussion. Now this king, on clear nights, liked to go up to the roof of his palace and gaze up at the sky. He'd look up at the stars, the planets, and the moon, especially the moon. One night, he had a strange notion. He wanted to touch the moon. The very next day, he summoned his royal carpenter and told him that he wanted a tower built right up to the sky. A tower up to the sky, sire? That can't be done. Can't? Can't? There's no such word as can't in my kingdom. I want you back here tomorrow with a plan. And if you're unwise enough to come tomorrow without a plan, I'll have you stretched on the rack to encourage creativity. The poor carpenter left with his head bowed, looking extremely anxious. But he returned to the throne room the next day, standing erect and with a business-like manner. He had a plan, which he described. He was going to build the tower by stacking up chests, strong wooden chests. The king was initially skeptical of this unusual architectural approach, but the carpenter assured him that if done carefully, it would work. A decree was put out across the kingdom for all citizens to bring their chests to the palace. Those who were reluctant to give up their chests were reminded that there was plenty of room in the royal prisons. Soon the chests started arriving. They were old and new, ornate and plain, hundreds and hundreds of them. And when they were all stored by the palace, the carpenter and his crew got to work. The method worked surprisingly well, and the tower quickly rose. Up and up it went. The carpenter's crew kept working until all the chests had been used, and the tower was an amazing sight. It went almost up to the clouds. Well, almost up to the clouds was impressive, but it wasn't up to the sky. So the king summoned his carpenter and told him that all available lumber in the kingdom would be put at his disposal to build more chests, to extend the tower. This was done. The carpenter and his crew worked hard and built many more chests, and the tower grew. It was extended up to the clouds. It was an amazing sight. It really was. But it wasn't up to the sky. So the king summoned the carpenter yet again, as well as the royal forester, and explained that he wanted trees cut down and milled into lumber, and that lumber used to build more chests to complete the monumental project. This was done, and as it happened, it took every tree in the kingdom had to be sacrificed. But the day came when the tower had been extended all the way up to the sky. It was the talk of the kingdom, and truly one of the wonders of the world. The king was delighted, and the day of completion was auspicious as well, for that night there was to be a full moon. the king announced that he would make his ascent at midnight. That night, the carpenter and his crew, along with a large crowd of well-wishers, assembled beside the palace to watch the king climb the tower. And climb he did, hand over hand, up and up and up he went, until he was finally up to the top trunk, and then he was standing on the top trunk, and there was the moon just above his head. He reached up as high as he could, but he couldn't quite touch it. He was so close, but however hard he strained, he couldn't touch the moon. He sat down on the trunk and thought for a bit. And he shouted down, Bring me up another trunk. The carpenter shouted back, there are no more trunks, sire, and no more wood to build one. The assembled crowd down on the ground waited in the moonlight to hear what the king would say next. It was very quiet. After a couple of minutes, they heard his voice faintly because of the distance. Pull out one of the trunks and bring it up to me. The carpenter shouted up, I can't do that, sire. The reply was immediate, if rather faint. Can't? Can't? There's no such word as can't in my kingdom. Do as I order you. The carpenter shrugged and indicated to his men to pull out one of the bottom trunks. Well, you can guess what happened next. The entire structure collapsed. Hundreds and thousands of trunks came cascading down out of the sky, old and new, ornate and plain, and of course the king, who did not survive the fall. So that was the end of the king who always had to have his own way and who wanted, above all, to touch the moon.
I guess it's a crime of the heart, isn't it? To ask people to do things that they shouldn't do for purposes that are foolish and cause such a disaster as that. So, so well done. And so now I have a little offering here too. It's called Talking Turkeys, and it comes from Margaret Reed MacDonald's collection of short stories. And she's a storyteller and author from Seattle, and one of the nicest people I know, so I always love telling her stories. She's also very generous. Anything she's written, you have permission to tell without having to ask her. This story comes from Syria, and there was a woman in Syria who was, as Margaret Reed MacDonald says, as clever as a Hoja. A Hoja there is a learned person and a teacher. And she noticed that the queen had a large flock of turkeys, which gave her an idea. So she managed to get an audience with the queen and told her how impressed she was with the queen's turkeys. Did you know, well, you must have known, Your Majesty, that they are a very special breed of turkeys. They have the capacity to speak human language. And I know how to teach these turkeys to speak our language. And indeed, if you gave me these turkeys for 60 nights, I could teach them not only one language, I could teach them 7 languages. Well, the queen wasn't a fool, but she thought pretty unlikely, but wouldn't it be wonderful if it actually could happen? She could talk to these turkeys that she loved so well. So she agreed to that. And then the woman said, oh, but I'm going to need special supplies for these remarkable turkeys. And she listed, she said, I'll need 100 bags of flour. I'll need 20 baskets of sugar, 20 baskets of nuts, 30 baskets of dates. And she went on with every lovely, delicious thing she could think of. And the queen agreed to it all. And so all of this was taken to the woman's house along with the whole flock of turkeys. And the woman then, for the next 60 days, enjoyed the most delicious pastries, all of the sweet and good things she could make with the ingredients that the queen had given her. And she just let the turkeys fend for themselves out in her yard. Well, by the 60th day, she came to the palace. She looked really alarmed and upset. And she says, Your Majesty, you know, there's something strange with the turkeys. And the queen says, well, could you teach them to talk? Oh, yes, she said. They all talk. They talk all of those languages. But the problem is they're all saying the same thing in all of the languages. Well, what are they saying? They're saying, the queen has a lover. The queen has a lover. The queen turned pale and then red and said, kill those turkeys. Kill them now. Don't let any of them back at the palace. And the woman said, of course, Your Majesty. And she goes back home. And for the next 60 days, 60 weeks, she has a turkey dinner a week from all those turkeys who couldn't actually talk, but close enough. So, now we're right at the break time. So that means, of course, in the tradition of storytelling, that means announcements. So the next storytelling is June 10th, Monday, June 10th at 7:30 at the Victoria Storytellers Guild, in person or in Zoom. And if you're not on our email list or a member, you can always check our website and you'll find the details there. You have to register first and then you'll be sent the link later. And we ask for a $5 donation. On June 14th, which is Friday at 7:30 in Nanaimo, the Around Town Tellers have their monthly session, and it's in person or on Zoom, and its theme is Out with a Laugh. And I think both Catherine and I are telling on that one too. So if you haven't had enough of me yet, for another $10 you can get another story. And June 23rd at 2 p.m. is the Duncan Showroom. And Laurie and I are still working out the theme. It has something to do with doors. We got to be careful because I've got two stories I really, really want to tell, so they have to fit the theme. Maybe not. Maybe not. There's doors everywhere and of every kind. So we now have our comfort break for 10 minutes. And if you weren't told already, the washrooms are just down that way. And for you're at home, well, smoke them if you got them. And we'll see you in 10 minutes or so.
Same damn road where we danced in the rain. Why sit broken, sit misused, talk is cheap, you're fumbling for the truth. I may be bad, I may be a saint. You can draw me up in whatever way. In that portrait that you paint, I may need love, I may love you, but I don't. Another reason for the blues. When I hear you talking about leaving town, it breaks my heart. This place let you down, that I let you down, that I may again, with every word left unsaid. But rest assured, you'll find grace. It's in your blood, it's in your name. In this time of leaving, some excuse, no now. It's just another reason for the blues. Another reason for the blues. another reason for the blues.
Got my eyes from my father. He never taught me how to dance with my lover. A pocket full of tales from my grandma. She said, gonna show you how to dance with another. Wake up, listen to your heart and wake up, and listen to your soul. Wake up, listen to your heart and wake up.
got my own roots to walk, got my own family tree, got my own set of heroes. It means something to me. Got my own road to travel, my own stories to tell. In my own time, got my own way of talking, got my own way to smile, got my own way of walking, my own look and style, got my own way of praying, my own way to sing. Still I'm connected to you, everyone, everything. I got my own list of questions, got my own truth to live, got my own handmade gifts I'm longing to give, got my own star to follow, my own rivers to cross, in my own time. Got my own way of talking, got my own way to smile, got my own way of walking, my own look and style, got my own way of praying, my own way to sing. Still I'm connected to you, everyone, everything. Still I'm connected to you, everyone, everything. Let's keep it simple, let's keep it sincere. I feel good, I feel good, and I'm here. I got a tide in my flesh. There's a moon in the sky. I've never been so low. Here's the thing about the tide, I'm on the rise up. I'm on the I got a tide in my flesh. There's a moon in the sky. When I get low, I get low. When I get high, I get high. And I hang it out the window. I sing it in the wind. I feel good, I feel good, I feel good again. I get a lightning, lightning, lightning in my chest. Let's be honest, let's be right here. Sometimes there's just no words, but you're coming in clear. I'm a natural man and I like what I like. I like the way you think, I like the way you get dressed, the way you bleed blood and breathe your breath, the way you hang out the window with your toes on the dash, the way you, yeah. I get a lightning, lightning, lightning in my chest. Let's keep it simple, let's keep it sincere. You feel good, you feel good from here. You got a tide in your flesh. There's a moon in the sky. I'll show you yours if you show me mine. I'm on the rise up. We on the rise up. We on the rise up. We're on the rise up. Yeah, I got a tide in my flesh. There's a moon in the sky. When I get low, I get low. When I get high, I get high. And I hang it out the window. I sing it in the wind. I feel good, I feel good, I feel good again. I get a lightning, lightning, lightning in my chest.
He's one in a million. I don't know when I'll be seeing him again. He wants to live in the city. Moved out there when he was just 17. Just 17. No, I'm not prepared. No, I'm not prepared. My heart's beating really fast. Really fast. But I wanna go there. But I wanna go there. Let's walk a little further. You know I wanna be here. I wanna go wherever, whenever you wanna go, wherever you wanna. I wanna go with you. I wanna go wherever, whenever you wanna go, wherever you wanna. Can I go with you? Oh, oh.
So welcome back. And as I'm the one making the program, I decided who comes next, and that's me. So this story is called Tattercoats, and it comes from a collection of English fairy tales by Jacob Joseph, I think is his name, very famous fellow, not around for quite a while now. So it begins with the observation that there was a magnificent palace right on the sea. And an old and very wealthy man lived there. He had no wife, she was gone. He had no living children. All he had was one small granddaughter, but he had never looked upon her face at any time in her life. He hated her. He hated her deeply and with a passion because his daughter, his beloved daughter, had died giving her birth. And when the nurse had wrapped up the baby and taken it to him, he refused to look at it. He said, "It may live or die as it pleases, but I will not look on its face any time in its life, whatever it decides to do." And then he went and sat in his chair by the window that looked out on the sea. And there he stayed. And he wept great tears for his daughter who had died. His hair and his beard was silver gray, and it grew. It grew into the chair. It grew into the chinks in the floor. And his tears that rolled down his face made a channel in the windowsill. And they made a little river that went down and into the salt sea. And there he stayed. The young girl, well, she had no one to look after her, no one to make sure she was fed or had clothing. The nurse, the old nurse, would, whenever nobody was about, she would give her plates of scraps from the kitchen, and she would take clothes from the rag bin, a petticoat, for example, to give to the little girl. And the girl, when she came to the doorway, the servants would bully her, and they would actually hit her, and they would call her names and mock her. And indeed, it was they who named her. They called her tattercoats because of the kind of clothing that she had gotten out of the rag bin. Her only companion was the gooseherd boy. She would spend her times in the lanes and the fields and forests, and with him and his herd of of geese. And when she was sad and lonely, hungry, tired, he would play on his little flute. And the sound of those notes, so playful and merry, and it would fall away from her fatigue, her hunger, her weariness. And she would end up dancing along with the geese as they danced to that music. And time went by. Then people were talking about the king. The king was going to be coming to their nearby town, and he was going to be putting on a great ball. And all of the lords and ladies of the land would be invited to come because his only son was in need of a wife. And so he was searching for a bride. And of course, there would be candidates at this ball as well. Now, Tattercoats wanted to go to the ball. She wanted to go to the king's ball. And one day she was sitting near the door of the palace and weeping because she couldn't go to the king's ball. And the old nurse found her there and was so moved and sad about it, she thought she would try and do something. Because a summons had gone out to all of the lords and ladies, including the lord of that castle. And when he'd gotten that summons, he had ordered his servants to come and cut him out, cut his hair so he could get out of that chair, and to bring him clothing and jewels to wear, and to saddle up the white horse with gold and silver and white linen so that he could ride to meet the king. Well, the nurse went up to her, and this is a very courageous thing to do, went to him and begged with him to take his granddaughter to this ball. She is the same level of society as you. Take her to the ball. Well, what she got from that was sour looks and implications, fierce words. She tried a second time. This is how brave she was. She tried a third time, and all she got was more of the same, except the servants now got into it, and they started shouting at her and calling insults to her, and actually came to blows and forcing her out of the room. Well, she wept with frustration and sympathy for that little girl who just wanted to go to the king's ball. She went to find her, but the girl was gone. The cook had sent her away, and she had run off. Well, she found her way to the gooseherd's boy, the herd boy, and he could see how upset she was. She was still weeping, and he said, "Well, why don't we do this? Why don't we go down into the town, and we can see all these people in their carriages and on their beautiful horses and their gowns and such, and we can see all that's going on." But Tattercoats looked down at her bare feet, and she could not be consoled. She looked at her clothes, her hands. So he hauled out his little pipe and began to play a few notes. And as he played, the sadness fell away, and she became more happy and joyful, and she and the ducks and the herd boy danced their way down the road. They were on their way into town and hadn't gotten that far when a very handsome, well-dressed stranger on a beautiful horse came up the road. And he asked them where was the king staying. And when he found out that they were heading the same way, he got off his horse and began to walk with them. And as they were walking, he was noticing Tattercoats, and the herd boy began to play a few low notes, a very sweet low tone on his pipe. And the more the young man looked at Tattercoats, the more beautiful he saw she was. And as the flute went on and the conversation went on, he fell more and more in love with her, to the point where he started to beg her to marry him. Well, Tattercoats laughed at that and said, "Why are you saying such things? Do you imagine what a scandal it would be if you married poor Tattercoats? And why do you seek to humiliate me, to get me to agree to this?" "No," she said, no. Go down and pick one of those well-born, well-dressed, well-educated women that you're going to meet at that ball, and don't make fun of Tattercoats any longer." But that music was still playing, and he was more and more desperate to have her as his wife. And so he begged her. And then he finally said, "Listen, to show you how serious I am about this and how much I want you to be my wife, come with the geese and with your friend, and come at midnight and come straight into the ballroom. And I will acknowledge you in front of everyone there and say that you are the woman that I want for my wife." And then he got on his horse and he left. Well, by the time they got into town, it was a little later, and they waited until it was midnight. And you could see the ball almost flowing out of the ballroom. The lights, the chatter, the music, the smell of the food, out into the central courtyard there. So she and the herd boy and all the geese came up the steps. They went right into that hall, right down the middle where the people were dancing. And they could hear the women gossiping as they went past and the men laughing along the side. They got to the middle of the room, all of them there, and her young man stood up beside the king, because he was, of course, as you will have already guessed, the prince who was looking for the bride. And he went down and he kissed her 3 times. And he turned to his father and said, "Father, This is my choice for a bride, the most beautiful and the sweetest woman in the kingdom. Well, the king stood up, and as he began to come down to congratulate his going to be new daughter-in-law, the herd boy began to play again, low notes on his pipe, that you might hear a bird off in the deep woods make. And as he did that, her clothing began to change. She became white, shimmering silk, etched with gold, and gold crown around her golden hair. And as he came forward, the trumpets began to sound, and the people outside knew that there had been a choice made. But in the moment, the herdsboy disappeared, and he was never, ever seen again. All the little geese were turned into little page boys, and they picked up the train of Tattercoat's gown. And way up in the gallery was her grandfather. When her grandfather saw all this, he left, got on his horse to return to his palace. He could not stay there, having sworn to never look on the face of his granddaughter. And so he returned to that great palace by the sea, and he sat again in the chair beside the window. And once again the tears rolled out from his eyes and down in the channel, and down to the sad and salty sea. So there was really there was a number of crimes of the heart, I think. All of those servants ought to be smacked, for one thing. But anyway, and I've had an interest in some things that deal with grief, and I found that story fascinating in that way. And so our next teller is Andrea Brimmel, and you already know all about her. And the story she's going to tell us comes from faraway Japan.
Hello again. So, as I was preparing stories for this day up in Duncan, I realized that I am drawn to stories that have fathers in them, about fathers who hurt their daughters. And I thought to myself, maybe you're working through some parts of your own life. Here's another story about a father and a beautiful daughter. This story is from old Japan, and there was a wealthy tradesman who had a beautiful daughter named Akiko, and she was as kind and generous as she was beautiful. Now, sadly, when she was a young woman, her mother died, and her father, the tradesman, remarried, but he remarried someone who was mean and sharp-tongued. And right from the get-go, she was filled with envy of beautiful Yukiko and how kind and generous she was, and how everyone else loved her so much. She always had a bowl of rice with fish for beggars who came to the door. She always showed them kindness and generosity. But this wicked woman couldn't stand her, and she tried to pile on all kinds of household chores and tasks that took her from dawn to dusk. But no matter what she did, Akiko always had a smile the next morning. And she just carried on, and she tried to overcome this, and was always trying to please this stepmother of hers. there were many people who came to the house and needed their help. As I was saying, she helped these beggars. Well, that just enraged the stepmother, and she said to Akiko's father, "Your daughter, she is going to give everything away. If it was her money, she might not, but it's not, so she just gives it away. And we're going to have lines of beggars here, and all your customers are going to turn away and go elsewhere. Now, is that what you want?" She was always trying to put in a wedge between Akiko and her father. Now, whenever she berated her, Akiko was the perfect Japanese girl, and she never protested or defended herself. She always bowed her head and stood there and took whatever the stepmother had to say. And tears would well up in her eyes, and she would just try to hide them. Now, the stepmother, she said to herself, "I don't know what it is about Akiko, but I just can't stand anything about her. I am so jealous of her. I just hate her, how beautiful she is and how good she is, and how her father loves her. But I must get rid of her. I must find a way to turn her out. I just can't stand this. I can't live with it any longer." And finally, one day, she had her chance. It was New Year's Day, and Akiko served last year's rice for their special New Year's Day feast. She immediately ran to her husband and she said, "Do you know what Akiko has done now? She has served last year's rice for our feast. The God of happiness will be angry with us, and we will live in shame and have bad luck for the entire year. Now you must send her away. It is the only thing to do." So sadly, her father could think of no way out, and Akiko was turned out into the night. It was just starting to snow. She had on but a light quilted jacket over her kimono, and she headed down the street and thought, "What am I going to do? What am I going to do?" Well, she stopped in at various shops to see if anyone needed someone to help there so that she could work and earn enough money for some food. But nobody needed her, and all the people were thinking, "What is this young woman out on the street for, looking for work? She comes from a wealthy family." And they shook their heads, but no one offered to help her. She finally began to feel the pangs of hunger, not to mention the cold. And so she finally stopped at an inn and knocked timidly on the door. The door was answered by the innkeeper. "Yes? What do you want?" he said unkindly. "Oh, kind sir, may I sell you my jacket in exchange for some rice and fish, some warm food?" Well, the innkeeper snatched the jacket from her and said, "Well, I will have to sell it first to see what it's worth." And he took the jacket and he slammed the door in her face. Well, Akiko waited there in her thin kimono and feeling the cold, and she tried to think of that warm bowl of food, and she began to dream about perhaps finding a place to work in a wealthy home where she could look after the house and arrange flowers. She tried to think of all these beautiful thoughts, but finally she just got so cold and hungry that she knocked on the door again, and the innkeeper was back, and he said, "Oh, it's you." And she said, "If you haven't sold my jacket yet, may I please come in and wait for you while you find out what it's worth?" But the innkeeper was done with her, and he said, "You are nothing but a nuisance. You will deter my customers. Be gone before I turn the dogs on you." And poor Akiko ran off in shame, and she just wanted to get away as fast as she could and out of that town. She thought, "I would rather die in the forest than in this town where I lived." And so she made her way to the forest. She said to herself, I've heard that wolves will kill people. Well, that's what I would prefer, to be killed by a wolf than to die of hunger in my own town. And she grabbed an old burlap sack from a garbage heap on her way and wrapped it around herself and went into the deep woods. And she walked and walked, and it had begun to snow, and it was cold, but there was a certain calmness and peace that she felt in the forest. And she just thought, this is the place where I'm going to end my life. And she waited and waited for that wolf to come and probably kill her. And soon she heard a growling in the trees, and a large wolf emerged, and she stood before him trembling, bowed her head and said, just kill me and get it over with. But the wolf spoke and said, I'm not going to kill you. I don't eat real human beings. Well, what do you mean? Of course I'm a human being. Ah, said the wolf, there are human beings, but there are real human beings. There are human beings who are bad, unkind people, and they are people like yourself, real human beings, full of kindness and generosity. Akiko shook her head. She couldn't believe what was happening. She said, well, how do you know this? I have magic eyelashes, said the wolf. And he plucked some out and said, I'll give you some of my eyelashes so that you will be able to tell when you look at people who are the true human beings. Now you take those into town and you look at people through those and you'll see what I mean. Well, Akiko felt some sense of hope at last. Dawn was coming, so she made her way to the next town. There was no way she was going back to her own town. And it was morning when she got there, and she planted herself in the town square. And she looked around at the people going by, and they looked normal enough. She saw a woman coming by, elegantly dressed. She thought, well, perhaps I'll look through those lashes and see what I can see. So she arranged the lashes amongst her own, and she looked at the woman. And she almost burst out laughing because that woman's head now looked like a chicken's head, jutting forward, beady eyes looking this way and that. And many of the people behind her looked like, other animals, mice, even fish, but not a single human being. And then a man elegantly dressed. Why, he had a pig's head and a snout and black piggy eyes peering about at people. And then she saw an inn door open and the innkeeper poke his head out and look to the left and the right. And his head was like a sly fox. And he squinted his eyes and looked at people. Oh my goodness, this was so revealing. Now she understood why she was treated so badly when her father had turned her out, and none of the people would have anything to do with her. They weren't true human beings. But would she ever find one? Finally, towards the end of the day, a young man was walking by, and she noticed how handsome he was. But then she thought, he has a human head. He looks like a human being. I think I'm going to follow him. And so she did, and he continued to look like a human being. He was heading sort of out of town, and eventually she caught up with him, and he said to her, I've noticed you've been following me. Well, she told her story as to why she was following him and said, you're the only true human being I've seen today. And they kind of laughed at the story. They fell into conversation, and soon he said, come back with me to my little home, and I'll feed you and and you can sleep there until you figure out what you're going to do. And so they went to his small cabin in the woods, and true to his word, he fed her and gave her a place to sleep. And, you know, this went on for a number of days and weeks, months. She looked after the house while he went into town to work. He was a woodworker. Well, after a while, they decided to start a business together. And they turned the little house into an inn, and it was doing well. And they eventually realized that they were in love, and they got married. And Akiko now had her own business to run, and she could decide whether she wanted to look after beggars, and she did, of course. She always had a bowl of rice for beggars going by, a bowl of rice with fish and vegetables, and she did the same for passing monks. Well, one day when she was out in the woods gathering edible food for their inn, like berries, roots, special plants, she discovered a stream that magically ran with beautiful, delicious rice wine. So she was able to bring that back regularly, and that boosted their prosperity. They were doing very well with their inn. Now, one day, a beggar came by. It was an old man. And of course, she gave him the food that he needed. And as he sat at the table, tears were running down his face. And he said to her, "I once had a daughter like you, so kind, so generous. But I turned her out, and now I don't know whether she's alive or dead. And this is my just punishment for what I did to her." And of course, Akiko looked more closely at him and realized that it was her own father. And so she embraced him, and he was overjoyed and begged her forgiveness. And of course, she did forgive him, and eventually he came to live with them and helped to look after the grandchildren and to tell the story of the wolf's eyelashes to his grandchildren. That's the story of the wolf's eyelashes.
Of course, I want the mother-in-law to be punished. Where is that for those of us who think that should happen? Well, I have a couple little stories for you. The first one is called The Last Word. There was a couple who had been arguing through their whole marriage. Each of them wanted the last word. It was so bad that one of their arguments had started at their wedding. And this argument had to do with a hat or bonnet that she was wearing. And they got in an argument over the ribbon and the bow that was on this hat. And it got so heated that at some point, the husband, new husband, cut the bow off of this ribbon around her hat. And that was the beginning of the argument. Not about him cutting it off. No. It was about whether the ribbon was blue, as he said, or green, as she said. Whether he used a knife, as he said, or the scissors of hers to cut it off. Years went by, and this argument would resurface again. No, it was my scissors. I ought to know. You took them out of my bag and you cut it off. It was my knife. I took it out of my pocket and I straightened it, and that's what I used. And it was blue. No, it was green. And it would go on and get really quite heated. They got older. They got older and older. They began to be seniors, they stooped over, and this argument, the same argument, would continue on, each of them trying to get the last word. Finally, one day, they had to go out somewhere, and he's saying to her, well, we have to, that the argument was going on, and he could see in her eyes that she was determined. It was be the scissors. But he was not willing to back off. He hadn't been willing for decades, and he wasn't going to do it today, not for the sake of a peaceful marriage. It was his knife, not her scissors, and it was blue, and it was not green, that ribbon. And he could see her building up for more of an argument. He says, well, we have to go or we won't get where we have to go on time. And so they go out, and they're walking along beside this canal, deep, dark, dangerous-looking canal. And he can see in her face, she's saying, I will never give up on this because I know I'm right. And my word should be the last word because I am right. It was a green ribbon, my scissors. Well, something welled up in him. He could just see this to the end of his days, dealing with this scissors and knife. And he knew it was a knife, and he knew that it was blue ribbon. But she would never, ever concede, and the argument would never, ever stop. Something welled up in him, and he grabbed her, and he threw her into the canal. Sploosh she goes, and as she's going down, he yells at her, knife! And she goes down, blah, 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 blah. And then she comes back up, and she yells at him, scissors! And he waits as she's flashing around, and she starts just as she's going under. Knife! Down she goes. She's coming up for the second time. She gets her nose above the water. Scissors! And he waits for the right moment. Knife! She goes under. Well, then she starts to come up. She doesn't quite break the surface, and he times it perfectly. Knife! As she starts to go back down again. And then her arm shoots up out of the water and goes like this as she goes down for the third time. The last word. Talk about crimes of the heart, eh? And there's a payment. So I thought to myself, and I've done this now, I think a couple times here, and doggy bags. Remember you used to get doggy bags when you left restaurants, and this was what was left over? And you could take it home. And I thought, well, I'm gonna give you a little story that I expect you to be able to tell to anybody you meet, and it'll be kind of like a little doggy bag that I'm sending you home with. So there was a monastery, and a young man had applied to become a monk. Well, this took a number of years, and the rules in the monastery were absolute silence. You didn't get to talk to anybody except on the anniversary of you joining the monastery. You would have an interview with the bishop, and you get to say 2 words. So our new monk arrives on the anniversary. He sits there in front of the abbot, and he says his 2 words. Food bad, he says. And off he goes. Another year goes by, and he has that precious interview with the abbot. He has his 2 words already. And the words are, bed hard. Well, thank you, my son. We'll see you in a year. And off he goes again. Well, now it's his 3rd anniversary. He comes in. He has his 2 words ready for the abbot. And he says, I quit. And the abbot says, well, I'm not surprised. You've been complaining since you got here. I know you can remember it. It's only 6 words. So now it's my pleasure on your behalf and ours to thank Longevity John and Ted Cadillac for for this opportunity to tell our stories here, and on your behalf to thank them and the tellers, Laurie Giffen, Andrea and Richard Brimmel, and on our tellers' behalf and on my own to thank you for coming here and joining us either here or online. It's said that there are 3 apples that fall when a story is told. One is for the teller, one for the listener, and one for the one who takes it to heart. And I think there's more than one of you who take these stories into your hearts, and we thank you for that. And I hope to see you here on June 23rd at 2 p.m. or online for our next collection of stories for adult listeners and those young at heart. Thank you.
It's a good, not in Sussex. I grew up